Hi, now that we've covered the national security strategy, what I'd like to try and do is quickly highlight the documents that build on that and that inform the activity of different levels of command across the national security environment. So in this session, we'll talk about the national defense strategy, the national military strategy, and then we'll drop down a level to the service specific and talk about the maritime superiority documents that have been built over the years. We want to start, I think, by understanding that the national security strategy really drives the national defense strategy and the national military strategy, and that both the national defense strategy and the national military strategy are now mandated by public law, something that didn't necessarily exist until relatively recently. When we look at the doctrine documents coming out of the Joint Staff, Joint Pub 1, if you take a look at the very top of it, it's an interesting way that the national security strategies provides the ends, that is what it is that we're supposed to accomplish. The defense strategy talks about the ways in which we'll accomplish that, and the national military strategy provides the means for it. It sort of is interesting that that reflects a lot of what we have tried to talk about thus far in class. So the National Defense Strategy is a document required since 2017 and public law at that point. And you can see the reference to what needs to be included in both the classified and unclassified version of this. This document is required on a quadrennial basis, and we've just finished completing the first iteration of it under that law. And what the document says, what it said in 2018, is that the long war on terror has tended to lead to a certain amount of strategic atrophy within our forces, and we need to correct that. We need to make sure that our competitive advantage is built back up. We need to do that in the face of a very, very disordered and chaotic world, and a world, moreover, which pays less and less attention to long-standing rules going back 75 years to the end of the Second World War, and that interstate competition is increasing and may be now much more dangerous to us than the threat of terrorism across the globe. So what the document says we need to be able to do is talk about the 4+1 idea. The 4+1 idea is really very straightforward. The 4 is comprised of 4 nations, 2 peer threats, and 2 rogue regimes for a total of 4. And then, of course, the 1 is the long-standing threat posed by terrorist organizations of all different kinds. And while we have to focus more on nation states, we can't completely ignore the threat from terrorists. And then finally, it talks about the ends. These are things that we're going to try and do. There's a whole bunch of them here. And I'll let you just sort of peruse those rather than trying to read them. They actually are all very, very common sense. They're not something that you would expect or would not have expected to see in something that is a national defense strategy. And we will try and accomplish all of the things in that long list, mostly by being operationally unpredictable, making sure that we work as a whole of government to try and get to decent solutions. And in order to do this, we really need to make sure that the force is joint, is truly joint, that it is extraordinarily lethal, that we work with our alliances. And I think most interestingly, to those of you who will be headed to a big service staff at some point in the near future, to reform DoD business practices. I think that there is a recognition across the department that we need to do a much, much better job in accounting for the money that we spend. We then go to the national military strategy, and General Dunford talked about that shortly before its publication. He said, look, we need to do 2 important things. One is we need to maintain or develop new international alliances, and we need to be projecting power across the globe. And when he talked to the Association of the United States Army, basically he said, we're going to do this, we're going to need to understand that the definition of war is changing, that it now includes things that are not simply kinetic force-on-force kinds of conflicts. And we need to understand the planning processes that we go through to try and get ready to go to war, and we need to change that. And we need to make sure, finally, that we need to have much better collaboration among the combatant commanders, because it's clear that most of the big problems we face straddle combatant commander geographic boundaries. So the new national military strategy is mandated in law, and it shows up, as you can see here, that it is supposed to be prepared every other year and even years. So as Dunford was speaking, and as I referred to it above, in 2017, the document was about to be published in 2018, and we expect a new national military strategy to show up sometime next year. This should be then continue to go on more or less indefinitely until Congress says it doesn't need to do that anymore. The national military strategy, then, as it was published, and you have a cartoon of the cover here, basically says that we're going to worry about how we employ and develop our force and how we design a new force. And then it talks the ways in which we'll do all of these things, talk about deterrence in ways that are strikingly similar to the ways we talked about them in the last session. And all of these really deal with how do we convince our opponents that they should not behave badly, and how do we assure our allies and partners that we will in fact be allies and partners with them over time. That then leads us to a consideration of the maritime strategy. The purpose of this slide is to try and demonstrate that there are a whole lot of aspects to the maritime strategy. Most interestingly, I think, is back now a dozen years ago or so, the chiefs of service of the Marine Corps, the Navy, and the Coast Guard got together and put together a document called the Cooperative Strategy for 21st Century Sea Power. And it was remarkable in that I don't know of any other instance when the three maritime service chiefs actually got together and thought their way through such a document. There are a number of core capabilities that the 2007 document talks about. Perhaps more interesting to you will be that this is the first time that there is a obvious and specific emphasis on both maritime security and humanitarian assistance and disaster response. The other four bullets on this, I think you would have expected to see at any time in the past. So these are adding missions, if you will, to the core capabilities. The service chiefs got together a few years later and decided that they needed to revise that, and they wanted to talk about what would that entail. And so just a few years ago, they put a revised cooperative strategy, and this really just builds on what was already existing in the original one. It takes advantage of a couple of things, and it emphasizes a couple of others. So it talks about naval presence being essential, and that the forward naval presence is essential, and that we need to operate jointly and together with allies and partners. The document also takes cognizance of changes in the operating environment, the threat of cyber warfare and other similar kinds of aspects show up in this document. And as a result, the overall goal of this is to talk, as you might expect for the service chiefs, about how we're going to actually build the force and how priorities can be established to build that force in a time of constrained resources. I want to point out that all times are constrained resources, that it doesn't matter whether you were in the Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, or Trump eras. Resources are constrained. We can't build all the things we want. And so this document talks, I think, effectively to what kinds of resources ought to be put forward and what the priorities might be. And it talks about how we will maintain our sense of superiority across the world's oceans, how we manage to protect U.S. sovereignty, and the kinds of things that we need to counter as a maritime force. Then just a few years ago, the Chief of Naval Operations decided that we needed to address the fact that the U.S. is once again returning to great power competition, and that involves Russia and China, and that we need to update what we're doing in order to ensure that the Navy remains a relevant partner to the national defense establishment in countering these threats. And so the design for that the CNO put forward really talks about the 3 bullets here as major things that the Navy needs to emphasize. And then they updated that again just about a year or so ago. That update really tries to talk about the idea that what we have is not adequate. A 355 ship Navy just won't cut it, and we have to have different ways of operating the fleet. We have to have new kinds of ships, and we need to work with partners across the globe in order to effectively carry out the missions that we are assigned.